Wait right there, Akeem. Rose bearers!
Coming to America brought together one of the most unforgettable casts in comedy, giving us kings, queens, fathers, and actors who turned even the smallest moments into scenes fans still remember. For decades, these faces gave audiences a reason to laugh, but behind the movie's success were stories most viewers never knew. From a legendary actor who quietly battled a devastating illness to a beloved star whose final years became consumed by family conflict, the people behind these characters faced struggles far beyond the screen. What's the real story behind these 10 faces? Stay with us till the end as we look at their tragic stories. Louie Anderson, at just 68 years old, on January 21st, 2022, Louie Anderson passed away in a Las Vegas hospital from complications of diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, a cancer he had actually known about for a decade, but chose to keep hidden so he could keep working and keep making people laugh. He appeared in Coming to America as Maurice, one of the more memorable supporting faces in a film stacked with them. Decades before winning an Emmy for playing Christine Baskets on FX's Baskets. Yet as we will see, Anderson's life was marked by years of personal struggles that shaped everything he became on screen. Long before Hollywood, there was a childhood defined by chaos. Anderson was the second youngest of 11 children, raised in a St. Paul housing project by a mother he adored and a father he described as an abusive alcoholic, a man who once drove the family car off the road into a snowbank while drunk, and who Anderson watched hit his mother more than once. To survive it, young Louie turned to food, calling it his lifelong addiction, a form of protection from a home that never felt safe. That pain followed him into adulthood, in other forms too. 2 marriages that each collapsed within months, alongside years of struggling with alcoholism and drug use before he finally got himself together. He spent the back half of his career turning that pain into art, writing best-selling books about his father and his mother, and finding unlikely late career success as Christine Baskets, a role that let him finally honor the woman who raised him. But behind the awards and the second act, his body was already fighting a battle nobody knew about. He kept his lymphoma diagnosis private for 10 years, choosing his work and his audience over rest. In the end, the disease that he had outrun for a decade finally caught up with him, taking him at 68, just as his career had found its most celebrated chapter yet. Yet, his childhood pain, his private battles, and his quiet, decade-long fight is just one of the painful stories out of many still to come. Don Ameche. Don Ameche was already known to audiences as Mortimer Duke, one half of the scheming, wealthy Duke brothers from 1983 Trading Places, when he brought the character back for a memorable cameo in Coming to America 5 years later. It fit him perfectly, because by then, Ameche was something of a Hollywood ghost story turned real. A man who had once been one of the biggest stars in America, only to vanish from movie screens for almost 30 years. Don Ameche built his name in the 1930s and 40s as one of the busiest leading men in the business. His voice so smooth that comedian Fred Allen joked the only thing in your house you could turn on without getting Don Ameche was the water spigot. But as decades passed, the film offers disappeared. For nearly 30 years, Ameche worked mostly in radio, television, and touring stage shows. Many assumed his career was simply over. Then, at 77 years old, everything changed. Ameche was cast in 1985's Cocoon, playing a rejuvenated senior citizen who breaks into a stunning dance sequence. The performance won him an Academy Award and a 30-second standing ovation from his peers. The man Hollywood forgot became its most beloved comeback story. But time caught up with him too. Diagnosed with prostate cancer in late 1992, the disease was already spreading through his body. Yet Ameche kept working anyway, finishing his final film weeks before his death on December 6, 1993, at 85, determined to leave on his own terms. Now, don't go anywhere because you really don't want to miss out on the next person on this list, Ralph Bellamy. He spent 65 years being the guy who lost the girl. Some saw him as the rich, boring suitor left behind by the leading lady. Others saw him as the detective who always caught his man. But above all, he was the reliable second lead who made the real star shine brighter. Ralph Bellamy built that career from nothing. He left high school at 17 to join a traveling Shakespeare group, then spent almost a decade working small theaters and touring shows before he ever stood in front of a camera. By 1927, he owned his own theater company. 2 years later, he made his Broadway debut. He did not make his first movie until 1931, playing a gangster, and from there, he built a career of more than 100 films across 6 decades. But the role that would define him hadn't even come yet. That role was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Bellamy played him on Broadway in Sunrise at Campobello, winning a Tony in 1958, then again on film 2 years later. He also played one half of the Duke brothers in Trading Places alongside Don Ameche, a pairing fans loved so much that both actors came back nearly a decade later to do it again in a cameo for Coming to America. In 1987, Hollywood gave Bellamy something bigger than any single award, an honorary Oscar for a lifetime spent playing the guy who never got the girl, and somehow making it unforgettable every time. But while audiences kept seeing him on screen, his body was already breaking down behind the scenes. By the early 1990s, Bellamy had been quietly living with a lung illness for years. Sadly, tragedy came knocking on November 29, 1991, when he died at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica at age 87 from respiratory failure. He spent a lifetime playing the man who came in second. Stay with us, because the next person on this list suffered an even more painful fate. James Earl Jones. James Earl Jones played King Jaffe Joffer, the towering, thunderous ruler of Zamunda in Coming to America, a father whose booming voice alone could fill a throne room and make even his own son shrink back into a nervous boy again. He was often described as one of the greatest actors of his generation, a man whose voice alone became more famous than most actors' entire careers. But behind that voice was a little boy who once believed he would never speak again. It started when he was only 5 years old. His family moved from his grandparents' farm in Mississippi to rural Michigan, and what should have felt like a fresh start instead felt like being torn out of the ground he belonged to. The trauma hit so hard that a stutter took over his speech almost overnight. By the time he reached school, it had gotten so bad that he simply stopped trying. For nearly a decade, James Earl Jones didn't really talk. He did not talk to his teachers or even to classmates. To make worse, he barely spoke to his own family. He wrote notes instead. The only voices he trusted himself around belonged to the animals on the farm, because they never laughed, never mocked him, never made him feel small for the way his words came out broken. Then came one teacher who refused to let that silence be the end of his story. He didn't believe a boy who couldn't speak in class could have written poetry that good on his own, so he dared Jones to stand up and prove it, out loud, in front of everyone. It was the kind of moment that could have destroyed him. Instead, Jones opened his mouth, and for the first time in years, the words came out whole. No stutter, just his voice, finally his own. That one moment in a Michigan classroom is the reason the world ever got to hear King Jaffe Joffer roar, or Darth Vader breathe, or Mufasa call his son's name across the savannah. A boy who was once too afraid to speak became the voice millions of people grew up trusting completely. James Jones died on September 9, 2024, at age 93. But the silence he fought so hard to break as a child never really returned. It echoed instead, through Zamunda, through a galaxy far away, through the Pride Lands, and straight into the memory of everyone who ever heard him speak. Madge Sinclair. What is a king without his queen? In Coming to America, Madge Sinclair played Queen Aeolian, the elegant wife standing beside King Jaffe Joffer. And right around that same era, when Disney needed a voice for Sarabi, Mufasa's mate and Simba's mother in The Lion King, they brought her back to stand beside the same actor again. James Earl Jones and Madge Sinclair played King and Queen twice, once in Zamunda, once in the Pride Lands. But here's the part you don't want to miss. While the world saw her as royalty, Sinclair's real story started far from any palace. Born Madge Dorita Walters in Kingston, Jamaica, she spent her 20s as a schoolteacher, married young with 2 little boys. At 30, she did something most people never find the courage to do. She left her sons with their father and moved alone to New York City with nothing but a dream. It worked. She joined the New York Shakespeare Festival, then broke out nationally in 1977 playing Belle Reynolds in Roots, earning the first of 5 Emmy nominations. But, as you're about to find out, her greatest performance wasn't one anyone applauded for. In 1982, 3 seasons into her beloved role on Trapper John, MD, Sinclair was diagnosed with leukemia. And here's the shocking part. She never stopped. She kept working through Coming to America, through an Emmy win in 1991, through voicing Sarabi in 1994, quietly outliving her doctor's predictions for 13 straight years, without most of the world ever knowing she was fighting for her life. Sadly, Madge Sinclair died on December 20th, 1995, in Los Angeles, at age 57. Her ashes were carried home to Jamaica, back to where she'd once left everything behind with just 2 sons and a dream. The queen the world watched on screen had been quietly winning a much harder battle the whole time, and she never let anyone see her lose. John Amos. He spent 5 decades playing the strongest father figures television ever gave America, yet somehow ended up dying without most of his own family even knowing it happened. Everybody loved John Amos, and that was the case from the very beginning. While his son and daughter waged a bitter public war over who was really caring for him, audiences only knew him as James Evans on Good Times, the father who held his family together through poverty most sitcoms never dared show. Many believe he was the one who gave black television audiences their first real, unshakable father figure. John Amos became the heart of an entire generation's living room, and fans responded in unexpected ways. He was never meant to become a symbol of family loyalty in real life, too. But he became one anyway. However, it seemed fate had tragic plans on the horizon. But before that, Amos had already built a career spanning Good Times, Roots, and Coming to America, where he played Cleo McDowell, a father just as protective as the ones he was known for. Amos's real family wasn't nearly as simple as the ones he played, and that was what made his final years all the more tragic. As he grew older, tensions between his 2 children, Shannon and Kelly, eventually exploded into a very public family war. In 2023, Shannon accused her brother of elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation, while Kelly was arrested that July following an alleged threat against his sister. And then things became even more complicated. John Amos publicly accused his daughter of being responsible for his mistreatment, despite her insistence that she had been trying to protect him. His own children were now telling completely different stories about what was happening behind closed doors, leaving the public with no clear picture of who was actually telling the truth. Many fans were left wondering how the man who had spent his entire career portraying a father who protected his family could end up surrounded by so much conflict in his own final years. And yet, the troubles didn't stop there. On August 21st, 2024, John Amos died at the age of 84. But his daughter wouldn't learn about his death from her family. She discovered it through the media 45 days later, after the news had already reached the public. And still, that wasn't the end of the story. Because losing John Amos is not the most shocking part of what we're about to show you. Bertie M. Hale. Bertie Hale spent less than a minute on screen in Coming to America, playing an elderly subway passenger in the background of one scene. Yet somehow, out of everyone in that cast, Bertie Hale ended up outlasting almost all of them, working steadily for over 3 more decades after the film wrapped. She was never meant to be remembered as anything more than a background face. But what she did with the rest of her life turned that small role into something far bigger. Before Hollywood noticed her, Bertie Hale had already built a real career on stage, appearing on Broadway in the 1975 revival of Hello, Dolly. By the time cameras found her, she wasn't some fresh face chasing a break. She was already in her 70s. And here's the part that's hard to believe. Most actors slow down in their 70s. Hale sped up. After Coming to America, she kept working, showing up in movies like A Rage in Harlem, Juice, Die Hard with a Vengeance, even guest starring on Law and Order, SVU, at 93 years old. Her very last credited role wasn't some quiet farewell. It was 2009's Breaking Point, filmed when she was 97. Bertie Hale died just months later, on June 4th, 2009, in New York City, at 97 years old. There were no headlines, no dramatic farewell tour. Just a woman who kept showing up to work, decade after decade, long past the age most people ever expect to see anyone still trying. She was still working the year she died. Let that sink in, because that's what makes her unique. Calvin Lockhart. Up next is the story of a man who left America to find the respect his own country wouldn't give him, only to come back years later and get exactly that. Calvin Lockhart played Colonel Izzy in Coming to America, but by then, he had already lived an entire career most actors could only dream of. Born Burt McCloskey, Cooper in Nassau, Bahamas, he moved to New York at 18 to study engineering, only to drop everything for acting, working as a taxi driver, carpenter, and restaurant owner just to survive while training with the legendary Uta Hagen. Lockhart's Broadway debut came in 1960, sharing the stage with a young James Earl Jones. But Hollywood in the 60s wasn't ready for a leading man who looked like him. So Lockhart did something few actors had the nerve to do. He left the country entirely, chasing better roles across Italy, Germany, and finally England, where Calvin became the first black actor to join the Royal Shakespeare Company as an artist in residence. He eventually came home to America a completely different actor, landing iconic roles throughout the 70s in Cotton Comes to Harlem and Uptown Saturday Night, alongside legends like Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby. Off-screen, he poured himself into an anti-drug campaign aimed at helping teenagers escape addiction, using his own platform to protect kids he'd never even met. By the time he filmed Coming to America in 1988, Lockhart was a veteran who had fought for every inch of his career on 2 continents. And then came the moment that nobody saw coming. Less than 20 years later, on March 29, 2007, Calvin Lockhart suffered a stroke in his native Bahamas. He died from complications a week later, at age 72, back in the country he once had to leave just to be taken seriously. But while Calvin suffered a stroke that took him quietly, the next person on this list experienced something far more tragic. Helen Hanft. Helen Hanft played the subway lady in Coming to America, delivering one of the film's most quietly beloved lines, "Go on, honey, take a chance." A moment that lasted only seconds, but stuck with fans for decades. It was the kind of role most actors would call forgettable. For Hanft, it was just one more brushstroke in a career built entirely on moments like that. Tiny, unforgettable flashes that made rooms feel bigger the second she walked into them. But as she was just beginning to enjoy the quiet rewards of a life spent doing exactly what she loved, tragedy was waiting. Long before Hollywood, Hanft had already built herself into a legend of a different kind. Starting in the early 1960s, she became a fixture of New York's experimental theater scene, performing in over 75 productions at places like La Mama and Cafe Chino, earning the nickname the Ethel Merman of Off-Broadway. Woody Allen cast her again and again in Manhattan, Stardust Memories, and The Purple Rose of Cairo, drawn to a presence nobody could ignore, even in the smallest part. She carried that same energy through Coming to America, License to Drive, Used People, and years later, Law and Order, never once chasing something bigger, simply doing the work. By 2009, she had finally slowed down, spending her retirement as a beloved face at autograph conventions and a quiet benefactor to libraries and schools across the city that made her. She had earned every peaceful moment of it. Then, on May 30th, 2013, Helen Hanft died in Manhattan, just 79 years old, from complications following surgery for an intestinal blockage. A woman who'd spent over 50 years making audiences feel something in only a few seconds of screen time was gone, almost as quickly as the moments she was famous for. Now, sit back, because the last person on this list is someone who is the reason you know Coming to America existed at all. Art Buchwald. To wrap things up, is the very man without whom Coming to America would never have existed at all. And yet, for years, the world had no idea his name belonged anywhere near it. Art Buchwald was a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, one of the most celebrated satirists in America. But his connection to this film started with a much older wound. Born in Mount Vernon, New York, Buchwald had a childhood most people never recover from. When he was still a boy, his mother was institutionalized for mental illness, and he and his 3 sisters were split apart and sent to live in foster homes. He spent the rest of his life building himself into someone unshakable, someone the world couldn't ignore. In 1983, Buchwald wrote a treatment called King for a Day, about an African prince who comes to America to find a bride. Paramount optioned it, then quietly dropped it, and years later released Coming to America without ever crediting him. For a man who had already fought his way up from nothing, being erased from his own idea was a different kind of loss entirely. So he did what he has always done. He fought back, suing the studio in a case that became legendary in Hollywood, and in 1990, a judge ruled in his favor. Paramount had, in fact, stolen his story. He lived another 17 years after that victory, but tragedy found him again at the end. Buchwald spent his final months in hospice, visited even by the French ambassador, who brought him a medal honoring his years as a journalist in Paris. He died in 2007 at 81 years old, finally at peace, in a home that was not his own. The world fell in love with Coming to America. It almost never knew the broken, brilliant man behind it. These are just 10 of the many deaths and tragedies connected to the stars of Coming to America. But we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Which of these stories surprised you the most? And which loss hit you the hardest? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now go ahead and click on the next video appearing on your screen. You won't want to miss it.